I haven't been buying bread for years. I grind my own grains and make my own bread. My favorite bread is made with Kamut, which is a variety of wheat with a mild flavor. I usually add some other grains to the bread, such as millet, wheat, oats, buckwheat, and amaranth. The different grains create different flavors and textures and a better mixture of nutrients. For a strong flavored bread, I add a bit of wild rice. Buckwheat and oats are so soft that I can chop them up in a coffee grinder, but the other grains have to be ground in a grain grinder. I pour all the grains into the grinder, turn it on, and after a few minutes I have flour. It's coarse compared to the powdery white flour that most people are familiar with. Once the grain has been ground, the oils start to go rancid, so I grind grain only when I'm about to use it. I don't save any of it. If I'm in a hurry, I just mix in some baking powder and bake it. Baking powder creates a bread that has the flavor and consistency of a pancake. Usually I make yeast bread. However, I take a few shortcuts so that from the time I start measuring the grains to the time the baking is finished is less than 2 hours. I mix the flour, yeast, and water for a minute or so. I don't waste any time kneading the bread. That might make a stronger loaf, but it takes a lot of time and it makes a mess to clean up. Salt supposedly inhibits yeast growth, so I don't put any salt into the bread. I want the mixture to rise quickly, so I put salt on the bread after it's baked. Or just before baking, like a pretzel. About an hour later, the dough has risen and is full of bubbles. I'm finished letting it rise. My next shortcut is to spread the dough on a sheet of Teflon to make a sheet of bread rather than a loaf. It's more difficult to make a loaf, and besides, nobody wants a loaf. We want slices or small rolls that we can eat more easily. This is a sheet of pure Teflon, which is why it's white and flexible. Sometimes I make the top of the dough smooth, and sometimes I leave it rough, and sometimes I leave it very rough. I prefer the bread with a soft crust, so after I spread it out, I put a covering over it. I let it rise for about 10 minutes, and then I bake it for about 15 minutes with the cover on. Even though the crust on this bread is soft, it has a similar texture to a conventional crust in that it resists butter, olive oil, pizza sauces, and other toppings. So I flip the bread upside down and use the bubbly side. This bread makes an excellent pizza crust. By the way, if you want to spread olive oil on bread, my method is to put the olive oil into a glass jar and let it solidify in the refrigerator. Then you can spread the olive oil with a knife. I certainly don't need to tell you what to do with a piece of bread, but I'll tell you one topping that I love that you may not have thought of. It's a mixture of cinnamon, stevia, or sugar if you prefer, some powdered salt that I ground in a blender, some pieces of frozen ginger. I freeze the ginger to prevent it from going bad, and it's also easier to scrape or cut pieces from it when it's frozen. Then I add some coconut oil and a little bit of molasses, or you could use brown sugar. I mix the ingredients and spread it onto the bread. By leaving the ginger as pieces, some bites have ginger and some don't, which creates variety. It's important to note that fresh bread loses its flavor rapidly, and whole grain breads go rancid, so this type of bread can't be sold in retail stores. You either have to make it yourself, or, if you've seen the articles and audio files at my website, then you know my attitude that we need to change our economy so that businesses can bake fresh bread. Using the techniques I use, a business can bake fresh bread in less than 2 hours. Furthermore, I suspect we could get even better quality bread if the hulls were left on the oats, buckwheat, and other sensitive grains until they were ready to be used for bread. When Christopher Bolin and his family stayed at my house in 2006, a bread I made almost every morning was a mixture of about half Kamut and half oats. I'd cut up some Granny Smith apples, add some cinnamon, molasses, and sugar, and then bake it. I didn't bother with any yeast or baking powder. From the time I started the bread to the time it was ready to eat was about 25 minutes. It tastes like a dessert, but it's a whole grain bread.